for people that get all their information from YouTube and from RFK, seed oils are bad for you. And fish oils and things like avocado oil and olive oil and butter, these things are good for you, right?
It's a little more complicated than that, but
it is a little bit more complicated, but if you want to break it down, make it binary, that's basically how most people understand it.
So I think the main confusion point is so I'm holding up, I don't know if people can see a little diagram here of fatty acids. There's saturated and unsaturated. We can talk about saturated separately, a very complex group in and of itself. Within unsaturated, there's mono unsaturated, one double bond, or poly unsaturated. Within poly unsaturated, there's omega-3, so like fatty fish, fish oil, and then there's omega-6. And this omega-6 more or less synonymous with linoleic acid just because of the proportions that are consumed. The way I want to define seed oils and stick to these terms as best we can, because I think this, if nothing else, is the main confusion point. If omega-6 rich foods are like highly refined and processed to get the oil that is heated and has additives added to it, that is the highly industrialized seed oil. True. And I think one of the big issues that arises is conflating omega-6 and seed oil. So let's start, because I think this is where we're going to have the biggest disagreement about omega-6. So the physiologic impacts of omega-6 specifically, and then we'll talk about processing.
Well, we can talk about relative amounts, because I think this is an interesting point. So what Nick is saying, so just to back to what we were just saying, so the average American consumes 5 tablespoons of seed oils per day. The most commonly consumed seed oil is soybean, perhaps followed by canola. Soybean is approximately 50%, give or take, linoleic acid.
And where are they getting all of this from?
It could be it's probably French fries, it's in breads, it's in salad dressings. So the majority of seed oils people are consuming are heated. That's an important point also.
Just basic processed foods.
Processed foods. Right. And so, and I think a lot of it is French fries, a lot of it is chips, right? Those oils are boiled and heated. So there's even nuance in the seed oil conversation that goes deeper, right? You can have a seed oil, which, as Nick correctly points out, is industrially refined, bleached, and deodorized oil, soybean oil, canola oil, peanut oil, sunflower oil, safflower oil. It's sitting on the shelf in a grocery store in a plastic container that can leach antimony into the oil. It's a transparent plastic container, so that is a fragile oil by nature of being polyunsaturated that is being exposed to light and oxygen for months at a time. This is just, and then you take those oils, and most of those oils that we consume today are then heated. Right? You're either frying with them in a pan or you're deep frying with them. So there are levels to perhaps the potential harm of these oils. As you heat an unstable oil, it becomes more problematic, more inflammatory mediators are generated. So we can talk about heated seed oils, we can talk about unheated seed oils, and as Nick is pointing out, we should differentiate that from not even processed sources of omega-6, things like walnuts, right? That walnuts contain moderate amounts of omega-6. They also contain moderate amounts of omega-3. But what I wanted to point out here is that, so let's just say corn. Corn oil is another commonly consumed oil, seed oil, industrially refined, bleached, and deodorized oil in our diet today. Again, chips, cakes, cookies, packaged foods. You look at labels, they're everywhere. French fries, obviously. It's in bread at all the fast food restaurants. Processed foods.
Yeah.
In order to get 5 tablespoons of corn oil, you would have to eat 60 ears of corn, right? Something that humans would never have done historically. 5 tablespoons of soybean oil is 2.5 pounds plus of soybeans. 5 tablespoons of peanut oil, something the same. You can look at these amounts. It's just just to say, like, a walnut, the amount of linoleic acid in a walnut pales in comparison to a tablespoon of, walnut oil is not really a seed oil because it's so unstable. It has so much omega-3, people never use walnut oil. It gets rancid so fast. But like a soybean is not the same as a tablespoon of soybean oil, right? A tablespoon of soybean oil is the equivalent of, hundreds of soybeans.
Sure.
And that's not even the best example. You have 2.5 plus pounds of soybeans to get 5 tablespoons of oil. These are evolutionarily, and again, I'm sort of stacking the deck in my favor. But I'm trying to say this as just in an unbiased way as possible. These are evolutionarily difficult amounts of oils to obtain from the actual parent foods.
Right.
So that's interesting. So we have those 3 differentiators. We're talking about omega-6 linoleic acid occurs in most unprocessed foods that you or I eat today. There is omega-6 linoleic acid in a grass-fed steak. It's a small amount, right? It's perhaps 1%. 1% of the fat in a steak is linoleic acid. 50% of the fat in soybean oil is linoleic acid. So you see there's a spectrum, right? An egg yolk contains linoleic acid.
Right.
So there's a difference between saying linoleic acid is, per se harmful, or is there a dose, or is there a form factor here as well? So yeah, and we can differentiate all those things, but that's just something I wanted to differentiate for people. Like historically, our consumption of linoleic acid today is 10x, 1,000% higher than it ever has been historically, because of our consumption of seed oils.
Do we know when our consumption, this 5 tablespoons per day, started? Like when did this start, and like how has it grown?
The first seed oil was introduced in 1911. Procter & Gamble made Crisco, right? So 1900, there were essentially 99% of the fat we ate was animal fat in 1900. And just to give context, again, record keeping not the same, but the heart attack wasn't even a thing. There was no diagnosis of heart attack in 1900.
Wow, that's
Humans
crazy.
didn't have like chest pain. Like that, this clinical syndrome is not defined until much later. Yeah, so
holy shit, global production of is vegetable oil the same thing?
Yeah, vegetable oil is the euphemism, right? So seed oil is
it shows all of them: palm, soybean, canola.
Yeah.
Wow,
so 1911 is Crisco, and then more and more become a part of it. There's interesting history from Procter & Gamble and the American Medical Association that I can mention because we're on the topic. So the American Medical Association, I think, was started in the 1850s, but it didn't really rise to prominence until the mid-1900s. And part of that was a major grant from Procter & Gamble to the AMA. So there's a lot of speculation. Again, it's just purely speculation, but Procter & Gamble makes Crisco. Procter & Gamble was really behind the popularization of, at that time, hydrogenated seed oils into the public sphere in place of butter and lard, right? Because animal fats, 1900, 99% of what we eat is animal fat. And then Procter & Gamble makes Crisco. They say it's cheaper, it's healthier, it's white, it's not going to raise your LDL. As we begin to understand lipoproteins, we can talk about saturated fats versus monounsaturated and poly and their effect on ApoB and LDL. In 1939, I think, give or take, Procter & Gamble makes the equivalent today of a $100,000 donation to the American Medical Association for their sort of radio show. And then the American Medical Association begins to sort of get more on this polyunsaturated fat bandwagon. You can find ads from, I would say, the 1950s and 60s of, these are incredible ads. I think they're from maybe Mazola corn oil, but you can see this becoming a part of the zeitgeist. And there's a great ad, maybe you can find it, Steve. It's like Denise or whoever it is, polyunsaturated her family tonight. So they're talking about cooking with this corn oil.
What?
There are these crazy ads. Yeah, so like anyway, they become a part of the conversation and the cultural milieu over the last, let's say, 100 years, give or take, starting in 1911. Before that, essentially, cottonseed oil was made in the 1860s, but not used in food until 1911. Previously, most people know this, but previously seed oils were used for lamp oils and for engine oils. And they were used in World War II on submarines and ships because they retain their slipperiness when they're wet. When we're talking about seed oils, if we're just kind of in that realm and we're saying, okay, what are the randomized controlled trials that have been done with seed oils?
Right.
You look here, so I summarized about 11 of them, and there's roast corn oil, there's Oslo Diet Heart, there's one called the Medical Research Council Trial, Los Angeles Veterans Trial, Sydney Diet Heart, Minnesota Coronary, the Diet and Reinfarction, there's St. Thomas Atherosclerosis, National Diet Heart Study, the Finnish Mental Health Hospital Study, there's Hautzmuller Diabetic Angiography or Angiopathy Trial. And so these are all done between, let's say, 1958 and 1980s.
Okay.
We don't have any more recent trials on seed oils.
Wow.
And if you go through them, I mean, we can go through them individually if you'd like, or I can give you a high level from what I think. If you go through them, what you find is that the trials are consistently poorly constructed. We have some trials which say seed oils increase the risk of cardiovascular disease. And you have some trials which say seed oils don't increase the risk of cardiovascular disease, or potentially even lower it. And
so there are some that say it lowers it.
There are some that say it lowers it. But in my analysis, this is my analysis, Nick can look at these, or he can give us his sense of what he thinks about the RCTs broadly as well. When you look at the ones that say seed oils are benign or beneficial, you can basically pick something wrong with every single one of those trials. For instance, if you look at the Oslo Diet Heart Study, we can double click on this.
Can
one
we
right
see
here.
who funds these trials too?
They're from so long ago. So here's
Right.
Oslo Diet Heart, 1958 to 1963, right? 5-year follow-up, 412 participants. It's a control group, and the experimental group is getting 76% of its calories from soybean oil in the experimental group. Now,
Okay.
the experimental group had a significant reduction in serum cholesterol, which was associated with a reduced coronary heart disease relapse rate. And I said here, so they had more seed oils and they had decreased coronary heart disease relapse rate. Now, the potential flaws, the control group, right, had 9.6% of their calories from trans fat. This is the problem, is that in the 1950s and 60s, we didn't really understand trans fat. So this is what I mean when I say these trials are poorly constructed, right? The experimental group, which is the seed oil group, was also encouraged to eat more nuts, fruit, and vegetables, and to restrict their intake of refined grains and sugars. So this is a randomized controlled trial that gets included in a lot of meta-analyses that will conclude, oh, seed oils are benign, but you see how poorly constructed the trial is. Like, okay, now you can go down here. We can look at another one. What's a good one here? The Finnish mental hospital studies, another.
Why don't we do these studies anymore? If it's such a hot topic in
I was
society.
reading the Minnesota Coronary Experiment study, which is done in a multi-center, multiple mental hospitals. And actually, I was joking with someone because there's a section where they're like, and this is why we didn't get patient consents. Bottom line, ethics have changed around doing these sort of experiments.
Ethics have changed?
Millions of dollars also, and who funds it. And I would argue, and this is just my perspective, the ultra-processed food industry is comfortably ensconced, right? They are making billions of dollars on these foods. If a trial came out that said seed oils were harmful, someone stands to lose billions, if not trillions of dollars. Who pays for this? This is a $15 to $20 million study over 7 years plus potentially, right? The ethics are difficult. And we're kind of stuck back to the ApoB thing also, because it's probably difficult within Western medicine to do any trial that could potentially raise your ApoB, because we're stuck in this perspective that anything that raises your ApoB will increase your cardiovascular risk. And we know pretty clearly, as we'll see if we look at Minnesota coronary experiment, that, and many of these, like Sydney Diet Heart also, giving someone seed oils lowers their LDL. But oftentimes, and I would say in the best constructed trials, not perfectly, in the best constructed trials, that doesn't equate to a decrease in cardiovascular disease. So there are all sorts of problems in terms of our sort of paradigm today, in terms of how we look at things. And there's this who funds it and why would it get done, right? Let's just look at the Finnish mental hospital study. So this is pretty commonly included in meta-analyses, 1959 to 1971, 676 subjects. Control diet, which is often the saturated fat-rich diet, versus the experimental diet. It was carried out in 2 mental hospitals near Helsinki. One of the hospitals received a cholesterol-lowering diet, a diet low in saturated fat and cholesterol relatively high in polyunsaturated fats from soybean oil. The other was served as a control with a normal hospital diet. After 6 years, the diets were reversed. Now, the use of the cholesterol-lowering diet was associated with significantly reduced mortality from coronary heart disease, okay? Now, there was significantly more trans fat in the control diets. The hospital K had 2% trans fat in the control diet versus 0 in the experimental group. And the hospital N had 0.6% trans fat versus 0.2. There were minor differences in baseline characteristics such as age, BMI, smoking, and blood pressure between the 2 groups. And there was a cardiotoxic medication, thioridazine, which we don't use anymore, that was more commonly given to people in the control group. So there was inadequate randomization also between the 2 things. So you can see how like obfuscated these trials are.
Yeah.
Like, how could you say what's going on? You're giving a control group in hospital K and hospital N a diet with significantly more trans fat, which we know is cardiotoxic. And then there's more patients in the control group getting a cardiotoxic medication like thioridazine, and that's going to make the saturated fat group look worse. So this is what happens with these trials, right? Now you can go through all of them and look at these, but what's important to point out here is that meta-analyses are written today, and they have these trials in the meta-analysis, and they'll say, oh, look at the combined. Like if you do a forest plot with the results of all 11 of these trials, you might find a combined effect which favors seed oils. But what if you throw out the trials that are obviously poorly constructed, right?
Right.
So then you have
the foundation of all the new stuff we come up with is these poorly done studies.
Yes, these poorly done studies, which will probably never be repeated.
That's crazy.
So it's this. We end up in this situation where we almost have to look at mechanisms because the randomized controlled trials, and then, you can look at stuff like, we can look at
And who was the guy Huberman was talking about? There's some guy at Stanford, a brain surgeon or something, who said, and Huberman said this, he said that this guy from Stanford, this brain guy, said like 60 to 80% of all the medical literature is either incorrect or outdated.
Bhattacharya has talked about that, or no, it's John Ioannidis.
No,
I think
he had like an Asian last name, like a Chinese or Japanese or something like that.
Is one thing to say
what was that guy's name?
Incorrect, another thing to say incomplete.
He said either incorrect or new stuff has basically.
Oh yeah, I believe that. You evolve models. That's what science is. It's never complete. It's always probabilistic and evolving. That's what's beautiful. I do want to get back into mechanism, but I think something to highlight, there is no perfect study. So you can always poke holes in a study. I think one that would be good to talk about that I actually think is on balance a pretty decent study that has gotten some heat is the Minnesota Coronary experiment, if we're going to delve into one.
We can talk about it.
So just to kind of give a high level breakdown of this, there were patients kept at mental hospitals and I think one nursing home, and they were given a diet that was either very elevated in linoleic acid. I think it was close to 14% of kcals from linoleic acid.
18 to 20
of calories from linoleic acid. Are you sure?
Well,
can you punch in on this, Steve?
Our experimental diet goal was to provide 18 to 20% of calories from polyunsaturated fat, while the control diet aimed for 18% of calories from saturated fat.
Okay.
There were 9,000, give or take, participants.
I think it ended up being like 13 point. I actually have a primary paper up here. Something like 13 point. Anyway, that aside, there was a larger. 13.2% of calories versus 4.7. So there was a randomized controlled trial. In this case, it was actually double-blinded, supposedly, where there was a group that was given more linoleic acid in the form of corn oil versus a group that got a higher saturated fat diet relatively.
Right.
And then the results were a massive drop in LDL in the corn oil group.
Right.
But trending towards worse mortality, so more deaths, and more cardiovascular disease, including on autopsy. So they had autopsies of these people.
Especially in the older age groups, over 65.
It appeared to be the case. The fact is a lot of the data weren't available. They were like in the basement on like 9-track tapes, and they had to be recovered.
There's a crazy story about this one.
Yeah, Malcolm Gladwell. You should have a podcast this morning.
Malcolm Gladwell did a podcast about this on his revisionist history called The Basement Tapes. Mm-hmm. The history of this is that Ansel Keys, who is a kind of an infamous researcher.
Yeah.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, Nick, but I'll just add this and then I'll let you run with it again. Infamous researcher in the 1950s and 1960s was one of the primary authors of this paper, and he and the main author did not publish the results for many, many years. And then Chris Ramsden, who's done a lot of interesting work in this space that we can talk about, some other stuff that he's done, actually found the information in one of these primary authors' basements and redid the analysis many years later. 16 years later, I think. So Ansel Keys.
And that's this stuff?
That's this study.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it wasn't originally published. Ansel Keys obviously was in favor of the hypothesis that polyunsaturated fats were good for humans. He was kind of the beginning of this diet hard hypothesis, and this didn't fit his results. So it's possible that he wasn't happy about this. Who knows?
Whoa.
Or they just got lost.
So I again come back to, it's interesting framing. Is it possibly suppressed? Maybe. I don't even know that that's a functional way to look at it.
Who knows?
So we can talk a little bit more about the study and the criticisms of it. Steve, can you go copy the PubMed ID in Paul's tweet and then go to figure 6 in the paper? It's going to become relevant in a second. But high level, the criticisms as I understand them, because again, there is no perfect study. It's been being talked about recently because I think Mark Hyman did a pretty viral reel on it where, like you said, in the other trials, there was more trans fat in one group. It's being argued that the higher trans fat diet was the corn oil diet and that accounted for the effect. And also about 3/4 of the patients dropped out of the trial.
It's complicated.
My 2 cents on this is, okay, first of all, I don't know how much the trans fat difference between the groups actually was, if at all. It's interesting. Ramsden and I'll actually talk about this in the paper. They talk about how Ansel Keys' new trans fats elevated saturated fat, so would have designed the diet in such a way.
They elevated LDL. Trans fats, elevated LDL.
Elevated LDL. So it would have been designed in a way to potentially minimize the trans fats. It's all speculative as to whether there was actually a difference in trans fats and what that difference would be. Now, even if there was a difference, I really find it unlikely that it drove.
You might go to my screen, Steve.
Oh, yeah.
I have that. And you want figure...
I was going to show 6 in the panel on the bottom left. You'll know what I mean when I say it. Show it. I don't think that the trans fat difference, even if it exists, would drive the full effect. It's possible.
Figure 5 or figure 6?
6.
Okay.
And then the other thing with the attrition, because this keeps on coming up, it's very easy to try to discredit studies like this by saying, oh, they lost 75% of their participants. But when you think about how it was constructed, the only way you get this sort of control is like hospitalized patients. And guess what? Patients get discharged. So they selected to do the analysis on patients who had been in the study over a year, and 3/4 or more or less got discharged from the hospital. But there's no reason, and I was talking with another scientist about this study, and I was making the point, like, do you have any reason to believe that would actually bias the results? They still had over 2,000 people. Yes, the N value decreased, but I don't see any reason why the attrition would lead to bias. So I don't think that can account for the findings. So how do you account for findings like, are we seeing Paul's screen? If you go down to the, scroll down a tiny bit, Paul, like the bottom left, you can read the caption, death from any cause and change in cholesterol in the cohorts receiving the diets for 1 year or more. And what do you see? Like, there's actually a pretty clear dose response from cholesterol lowering and probability of death. That's what it's saying. The more right you go, the lower the cholesterol drops as a result of the intervention, and the higher the probability of death.
The lower the cholesterol goes, the more people die.
And again, it's really important to be clear about what claims I am making and what claims I'm rebutting or not making. So I'm not saying omega-6 linoleic acid kills. I'm not making that claim. What I'm saying, and actually if you read the Ramsden paper, they more or less make this point, is this is highly inconsistent with the current diet heart hypothesis, and that we need to be more humble about our knowledge based on the evidence and not make sweeping recommendations like chop saturated fat, increase unsaturated fat, and LDL is bad, and if you lower it, it's good. It's, again, the idea of the myopic focus on LDL.
Yeah.
It's rebutting a claim, not necessarily making the extreme opposite claim. And I think that's super important.
I mean, these might be interesting to look at too.
The higher the cholesterol, the lower the mortality rate?
As the cholesterol dropped, more people died. So as people we talked about this earlier, as people got the seed oil group, they cholesterol drops. When you give people polyunsaturated fats, you will lower the LDL. We can talk about the potential mechanisms there. And so in the Minnesota Coronary experiment, and these are the Kaplan-Meier survival curves, which we can talk about as well.
Okay.
In the Minnesota Coronary experiment, the people that had the highest degree of cholesterol lowering had the highest increased rate of death, right? Wow. The most increased rate of death. And what Nick is saying is that this is in contradistinction to the mainstream recommendations that cholesterol lowering is always good. And this is why Minnesota has been talked about so much. It's the largest trial that we have. It was very rigorously conducted. Again, Ansel Keys, a proponent of the diet heart hypothesis, was one of the key investigators here. It was double-blinded. So what that means is that the patients nor the doctors knew what was in these burger patties that they got. This is like the equivalent of Beyond Beef in the 1950s and 60s. Some people got burger patties that were enriched in corn oil, and some people got burger patties that were enriched in other saturated fat-rich margarines. As Nick has pointed out, both groups probably got trans fats. And one of the criticisms of this study has been, well, did the experimental group get more trans fats? And then, as Nick and I believe, are both arguing, what we know about trans fat is they raise LDL, right? And in the experimental group, the LDL tended to go down.
Right.
So if the amount of trans fat in the experimental group were significant enough to skew the results, then why did the LDL go down so much in the experimental group? And why was it that the more the LDL went down, the higher there was the incidence of death, right? So you're having worse outcomes. Essentially, like, it's trending toward worse outcomes when you give people more seed oils potentially, which is different than what the experimenters expected.
What do you think the ultimate cause? I know there's probably multiple causes, but what do you think the ultimate cause is of why so many people are obese in America?
This is the big question, man.
So actually, this is a good place to talk about mechanisms. Do you think seed oils can cause obesity, and if so, how?
Okay, so let me pull up another study that I found this one in preparation for this podcast. I think you guys will find this interesting. So there are a couple of things here. Could
endocannabinoids.
Yeah. So this one is interesting. This is a trial from 2020, and it looked at levels of 2-AG and anandamide. These are endocannabinoids, similar to cannabinoids that you would get from like marijuana, in 183 obese females from Iran. And what they found was that there were 3 major dietary patterns: Western, healthy, and traditional. And the obese women who had the Western dietary pattern had higher levels of 2-AG and AEA. The reason this is interesting to me is because these can affect appetite and satiety in a negative way, right? So you get the munchies from smoking weed, right?
Yeah.
And conversely, there's a drug called rimonabant, which is a CB1 antagonist. So cannabinoid receptor 1 antagonist is rimonabant. Rimonabant works very well to reverse cardiovascular disease in trials. It reverses obesity in many ways. It minimizes appetite in a lot of ways. From a psychiatric level, it creates suicidality.
Oh, shit.
So it's off the market in the United States. But when you block the CB1 receptor mechanistically with rimonabant, you get positive metabolic outcomes. So it's interesting to me that in obese women who eat a Western dietary pattern, which of course encompasses many things, but will include seed oils, also processed grains, processed sugars.
Right.
That does correlate with higher levels of endogenous cannabinoids, 2-AG and AEA. 2-AG and AEA are some of the breakdown downstream products from arachidonic acid, from linoleic acid. So it's possible, right, that in predisposed individuals, potentially individuals who have polymorphisms in D6D, right? So fatty acid desaturase 2, or who are predisposed. Is it possible that consuming linoleic acid or Western foods increases the production of 2-AG and AEA, leading to appetite dysregulation? It certainly happens in animal models. If you give mice or rats linoleic acid, you see levels of 2-AG and AEA rise. I can show you that study too. No one's actually done that study in humans. Nobody has looked at levels of 2-AG and AEA in humans when they give linoleic acid. But it's interesting that in obese females with a Western dietary pattern, you can correlate that with higher levels of these. So this is just one putative mechanism by which seed oils may affect satiety.
Interesting.
But when we're looking at, I'll say this and then I'll pause, Nick, and let you add whatever you want. When we're looking at obesity, I think that appetite and satiety are key, right? Because you probably know this, Danny. It's pretty hard to overeat unprocessed food. Like when you're eating steak and squash, you just get full.
Yes.
And you're kind of done.
Right.
But something different happens when you add a potato chip or whatever. Like
it's like you can't stop. It's like crack.
A Coca-Cola, right? Something, and this may tie into leptin and fat and the hypothalamus, and Nick can talk to that as well if he wants. But like there is some saboteur to our satiety, I believe, within our food supply, right? It's not, Nick said he doesn't believe it's calories that are making us obese, and I would agree with that. My take on that is it's the quality of the food you eat, not the amount of calories you eat, because I sort of feel, and this is again just my perspective, that if you are eating generally high quality unprocessed food, you will become a predominantly healthy human, and your satiety mechanisms will be intact, and you will be unlikely to overeat. If I put a gun to your head and force you to overeat, I could, right? But generally speaking, in a free living human, you're not going to overeat steak, potato, right? Unprocessed food. You're going to overeat chips, Tostitos, Takis, brownies, Coca-Cola. So there's something going on with satiety. So when I saw this, I was like, that's really interesting. Is it possible, again, just a possible putative mechanism, that some people are more predisposed to this? Western dietary patterns affect the levels of these endogenous cannabinoids and make us hungrier. There are lots of other potential mechanisms by which seed oils may affect obesity, but that's just one of them that I thought was cool.
I think it's an interesting hypothesis. I want to, you would agree, I don't mean this to be offensive, but that is stretching. Do you think?
Well, I mean, you see higher levels of these in women with a Western dietary pattern. In animal models, giving linoleic acid leads to higher levels of 2-AG and AEA. I think every piece is there. In in studies where the levels of linoleic acid are decreased, you can see these also go down.
Let me phrase this a
When
different way
people
then.
lose weight, these go down.
Let me put it a different way then. Even if this is part of the puzzle, what percentage would you attribute the obesity epidemic to this mechanism and then seed oils in general?
Who knows? Who knows? It's impossible I can't tease that out, right? Because seed oils, most of the time, co-occur with other things, right? So broadly speaking, I think that we can take a step back and say, we can all probably agree that a Western dietary pattern is harmful for humans. A Western dietary pattern is essentially, you can think of the epitome like a piece of, like a processed sweet roll of bread, right? It's processed flour, processed sugar, processed seed oils, potentially some dyes, some dough conditioners, and some preservatives. We know that that is a metabolic nightmare for humans. And so if we try and tease it out, it's difficult to do that, right? We have these randomized controlled trials where we're looking at saturated fats versus seed oils specifically. But I think it's impossible for me to attribute specifically to seed oils. I think that when I look at the evidence on balance, seed oils look to be harmful for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to ask a few, this is really helpful. I think people are going to appreciate hearing this from you. You have a big following, a lot of clout. That's easy to name. So I'm going to ask you some, like, on a scale of 0 to 10, how confident are you?
Okay.
So on a scale of 0 to 10, how confident are you that linoleic acid can cause obesity in humans?
Now, obesity wouldn't be the first outcome that I would think of. When I think of linoleic acid, the thing I'm most concerned about are, the two things I'm most concerned about are propensity for LDL oxidation and incident coronary artery disease.
Okay.
And downstream effects of oxlams. And then obesity is just more complex.
All right, so we'll start with negative downstream effects on LDL oxidation and production of oxalams. 0 to 10, how confident?
Those are two different outcomes.
Oxidation of LDL.
Pretty confident. There's
Give me a number.
8 to 9, multiple randomized controlled trials showing that more linoleic acid leads to higher levels of oxidation of LDL.
And how about obesity, out of curiosity? And if it's a 2, then say 2.
Obesity is it's just such a complicated thing, right? So is your question, what contribution to obesity do seed oils have? Or
omega-6, and then I'm going to ask about seed oils. Those are two different questions.
Oh, okay. So you're asking about omega-6.
Omega-6.
Well, I guess, I don't know that we can necessarily differentiate those because omega-6 don't occur, like, are you talking about like walnuts?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
no, I don't think walnuts cause obesity much.
But to be clear, like 3 ounces of walnuts is something like 32,000 milligrams of omega-6. There's a ton of omega-6.
Let's check that.
Yeah. Steve, you want to check how much omega-6 is in an ounce of walnuts? I think it's something like 10,000 plus milligrams.
Well, that's less than a tablespoon, but okay. I mean, if we're talking grams, right?
Okay, 10 grams.
10 grams, yeah.
Of just linoleic acid.
Yeah.
An ounce of walnuts contains roughly 10.8 grams of omega-6 fatty acids.
Wow. Sure.
So, and I think I understand your position on this, but I don't think most people do. This is why I'm asking the question, not to be a dick.
It also contains 2.5 grams of omega-3s.
ALA. We can talk about that later. But okay, so if somebody were to consume 4 ounces of walnuts, that's like, on the order of 43, 44 grams of just linoleic acid.
Right.
So that's going to be, multiple, like near almost 400 calories from just linoleic acid. You're on 2,000 calorie diet. That is 20% of your calories from linoleic acid. So could 4 ounces of walnuts be bad for you? Cause obesity?
I think it depends on the context. Yeah. I think that in general, if we're talking about walnuts specifically,
maybe. You're a very unconfident, this is interesting maybe, but we don't know.
Yeah, we don't know.
Okay. I think that's useful to hear. Now,
and again, like the walnuts conversation is very different than the seed oil conversation.
I agree. But the reason I'm asking these questions so explicitly, again, not just to give you a hard time, but because I think we understand the distinction in our minds. I just don't think it gets discussed. Like I have literally, the degree of domino chain logic creep that you see is like, okay, highly oxidized processed seed oils are bad. Then it's omega-6 are all bad. Then it's polyunsaturated fats. They're fragile and they're bad for you. I have literally had me say that like have people tell me that Quest candy bars, non-ironically, are healthier than sardines because they're high in PUFA. And it's just like, but
Sardines are high in PUFA, or Quest candy bars are high in PUFA?
sardines, they have omega-3. So like,
Oh, well, yeah.
I'm just saying
Right.
that is at the extreme end of the interpretation.
Sure.
But triage point 1, if people get nothing out of it, is linoleic acid, omega-6 in whole food is very different than the heated processed stuff, right?
It's certainly going to occur with many other cofactors, vitamin E, et cetera.
Right,
Yeah.
right. But also there's going to be, just to complete the picture on what happens once it's in the body, even aside from outside, you mentioned obesity. One thing I think is really interesting as a hypothesis is, could a certain metabolic state, let's call it obesity, make you more susceptible to omega-6? So you talked about LDL oxidation. One enzyme and a biomarker, you can go to Quest or LabCorp and get this measured. It's called myeloperoxidase, MPO. Myeloperoxidase is really interesting because it increases cardiovascular risk in several ways. One way is increasing the oxidation of LDL from within the vessels. Interestingly, it's produced by fat, actually around blood vessels. It's called perivascular adipose tissue. It decreases fat browning and decreases energy expenditure, at least in animals, and then decreases adiponectin, which is, adiponectin is kind of like a yoga class for your arteries. So basically this fat-produced hormone that does go up in obesity makes blood vessels stiffer, oxidizes LDL. So just the oxidation effect, if you have an environment where you're more susceptible to oxidation, have higher levels of this enzyme because you have more fat tissue secreting it, you might be more susceptible to damage from quote unquote excess omega-6 versus, say, you're lean, healthy, on a ketogenic diet. Linoleic acid is incredibly ketogenic. Turns into, like, I can boost my ketone levels with sesame oil over 20 hours to like 6 millimole.
Yeah, whether that has any clinical relevance is questionable.
The point is, whether we're talking about 12, 13 dihomey, I guess we're calling it, oxidation by myeloperoxidase, generation of 4-HNE turning into ketones, this biomolecule has so many paths.
Sure, linoleic acid can go a lot of different places.
And the metabolic milieu, your metabolic status, influences how you partition, how you partition everything, how you partition calories, how you partition linoleic acid into different biomolecules. So I emphasize this because I want people to be thoughtful, just like applying it to their own life. What food are we talking about? And what is my metabolic status? If you have pre-existing obesity and you're eating a mixed macronutrient diet, maybe you shouldn't be cooking. I would think you shouldn't be cooking with corn oil. I'm going to agree with you on that. Your lean, healthy keto are, 2 ounces of walnuts bad for you? I don't think so.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
It's a different situation, yeah.
Oh, I agree. And I think that's really, those are extreme examples.
Yeah.
But they highlight a very important point.
Yeah, I think most of what I think is important about this conversation is the presumably oxidized, refined, bleached, and deodorized seed oils.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you now, refined, bleached, and deodorized, big $10 scary words. Right. Specifically, what's going on that you're concerned about in that the refining, the heating, oxidation, we can table that, that's obvious. Refining, bleaching, deodorizing. What specifically in that chemical process is increasing risk?
What is isn't there something called hexane or something?
There is hexane, yeah. Yeah, you can measure
neurotoxic.
Benzene also.
Hexane is neurotoxic, but again, it's a question of...
And hexane comes off of when you do the bleach and the oxidizing of these oils.
It's used to extract the oil from something where...
Right.
You can imagine it's hard to extract oil from corn. So it's used to separate out the oil, and then they try to remove the hexane, but some residual remains. I tried to look for how much residual remains, and it does vary. I think there's one study out of Iran or something like that I found. But my question is, again, this comes down to what do we know and what do we don't know? The fact that there is something that has neurotoxic potential used to treat food, I think is, that concerns me. But that's very different from someone saying seed oils contain neurotoxins and implying that there's actually seed oil associated neurotoxicity, which it's hard because you wouldn't go off of what is required to cause acute toxicity. It's not like you're going to have a tablespoon of corn oil and get neurotoxicity. So there's the argument of small cumulative doses are problematic. It's a reasonable hypothesis. The thing is, I don't think we'll ever really know.
There have been studies on this. Steve, will you show my screen real quick? So we have, this is a study on the estimated of trace amounts of benzene and solvent extracted vegetable oils and seed oil cakes. All seed oils are solvent extracted. So Again, they're talking vegetable oils versus seed oils, but you can look in here and you can see if you read the paper that there are often trace amounts of benzene, which is a known carcinogen in seed oils. There are other potential contaminants also. So we have studies looking at...
Acroleon's one?
Acrolein is one. That's when you heat the oil. You can look at the presence of heavy metals in vegetable oils. That's been looked at. Now, I mentioned this early in the podcast. Antimony is probably the biggest issue. It's migration from the polyethylene containers of edible vegetable oils. And then the third one to consider is that the vegetable oils are actually quite high in phthalates. We haven't talked about this at all. Phthalates are endocrine disrupting sort of fragrance.
Phthalates are in vegetable oils?
Yeah. And this is, they say it in the title, non-negligible exposure source to humans.
Wow.
And they actually give a relative amount here. In this paper, they do the calculated average estrogenic equivalence of several major phthalates in edible oils. It falls into the range of 2.7 to 958.1 nanograms of estradiol per liter, 45 to 396 times those in bottled water. So this is a non-negligible amount of estrogenic equivalence from these phthalates. I mean, we're talking like there's a massive exposure to humans today cumulatively to these phthalates. So if I've never heard many people talk about this in seed oils, and whether this is coming from the processing or the storage in the plastic containers, you could solve this by putting a soybean oil into a glass container, but that's never going to happen, right? Most of these oils are in these polyethylene plastic containers on the shelf for many months.
Yeah, it's interesting. Years. I wasn't aware of buying the oils in glass. I knew glass bottles would probably be better, but I wasn't aware of the importance of having a glass bottle that doesn't have exposure to UV light. The UV light has some sort of effect on the oil in the bottle.
It's part of the oxidation process. Light, heat, and oxygen are part of this process that breaks down the oils. Yeah.
Oh, that's
There's another study that I can find in a moment that actually looked at the peroxide value in omega-3 and omega-6 oils, and they might have looked at acrolein or other breakdown products. I know we talked about a study, Nick, where they heated oil, right? And this is interesting. So you can take, we discussed this earlier in the podcast. Again, we're differentiating this from a handful of walnuts in function here. In practice, you don't put walnuts into a deep fryer, but you put soybean oil into a deep fryer. If you go to Five Guys, if you go to In-N-Out, if you go to McDonald's, if you go anywhere, I've asked them what's in their fryer. It's usually some mix of soybean oil, corn, and canola oils.
And they change the oil once a month?
Once a week, probably, which is pretty crazy when you think about you're going 24 hours or 16 hours a day in the fryer oil.
Yeah.
So, I just texted you the graph. Your computer's hooked up. You can pull it up. Yeah,
well, if you look at what's in, some of these oils, these are the aldehydes, and some of these aldehydes they're quite high with heating. There's another graph in the paper where they talk about the amount of specific aldehydes and acrolein specifically. The amount of acrolein in a large French fry at McDonald's is equivalent to the amount of acrolein in a pack of cigarettes. Now, this is just one compound, and when I've said this in the past in my content, people like to say, Paul Saladino is saying that seed oils are worse than cigarettes, which is not what I just said. People can rewatch the tape, but it's basically saying that of this one compound, which is a carcinogen, which is very likely, it is pretty significant. So this is a quote from there. 154 gram potato chip serving aldehyde contents are not dissimilar to those arising from a daily allocation of 25 tobacco cigarettes. So this is what we're talking. This is a specific use case of seed oils, right? This is a heated fry. This is potentially the worst use case of seed oils,
right?
That looks to be very bad, but at least in terms of that one compound. So there's a spectrum here.
So what about like Steak and Shake down the road? They're advertising that they cook all their fries in tallow now.
So my perspective is this doesn't solve the equation completely. If you actually, when you rate into that one, they never solved this problem where the fries were pre-soaked in seed oils.
Oh no.
So they're cooking them in tallow. The tallow they're cooking them in has been altered. It's refined. So it has less saturated fats and more monounsaturated fats, so they can work with it more easily. So it's a It's a liquid at room temperature. Tallow is not usually liquid in 73, 74 degrees. So the Steak and Shake tallow is a refined tallow that has more monounsaturated fats, less saturated fats, just at a clean, just a simple organic chemistry equation, like a peroxide value. The more unsaturated an oil is, the more quickly it's going to be damaged when you heat it. And so theoretically, if you had a higher saturated fat content oil, like a pure tallow, which is a refined, which is sort of an oil that is from beef fat, right? So people don't know tallow, it's a beef fat. It's solid room temperature. If you were to heat that oil, it's going to have a lower degree of oxidation, not zero, but a lower degree of oxidation relative to olive oil. Olive oil will have a higher degree of oxidation, a lower degree of oxidation relative to a seed oil. Down the road we go. And so theoretically, Steak and Shake cooking in their fries in tallow decreases the amount of things like this acrolein, these aldehydes.
Yeah.
Somewhat, but I just think that for human health long term, look, I've eaten French fries in my life. We're all gonna eat French fries, but if you have any significant amount of your diet that's from a deep fried food, no matter what it's cooked in, you're probably not optimizing.
Yeah.
And I don't think it completely absolves it. You can't just cook in tallow, deep fry something in tallow and expect it to be not have any oxidative liability in the human organism. So there's a lot
this is like,
to unpack there.
I would go a step further and say calories don't cause obesity.
I agree with you.
And I want to unpack that a little bit because I know where people's minds go and they have a visceral reaction. But I'm not saying calories don't matter. I'm not saying that. When you take the energy balance equation, calories in minus calories out equals weight change, what is that? That is a post hoc description of what happened. It is not in any way, shape, or form a biological explanation for obesity. So I'm not saying calories in, calories out is a wrong model for obesity. I'm saying it's not a model at all. It doesn't give you a physiologic explanation. And the narrative around calories, I think, is one of those things where with enough exposure, just the mere exposure effect, you start to internalize a message and then thinking gets shut down. Rather than thinking about the complex multifactorial cascade of factors that goes into determining what is ultimately the dependent variable, not the independent variable, the dependent variable, calories, it's easy to sweep it under the rug. I try not to ascribe intention to these things. Maybe there is intention. I mean, there are incentive structures, but I like to frame it as incentive structures, as why is or isn't something getting talked about without implying an individual person is sinister per se. A good example I'll bring up that really I found curious. It was this, I mentioned it to you earlier, the statins GLP-1 paper. So the two biggest drugs probably in history, or to be the biggest drug is in history, are statins. I think, $1 trillion market over time, something like 20 billion.
When did statins first come on the market?
Oh, I don't know. In mid 1900s, but probably.
Really?
Yeah. What was the first one? Was it Lovastatin?
This might be a Steve question.
Yeah, I'm not sure. But definitely one of the biggest, most prescribed drugs. I think 1 in 4 people over 40 are taking it for secondary. Yeah, something like that. So actually, that was in the paper. I can share the reference. But so anyway, this paper came out in Cell Metabolism last year. Now, let's be clear. Cell Metabolism is not a dinky journal. It's a highly regarded scientific journal.
1987.
With Lovastatin, yeah.
And this was a human trial where they effectively showed that statins chop GLP-1 levels in humans in half.
Okay, what's GLP?
So GLP-1 is the hormone that drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy try to mimic. So now there's this huge drug market about not exactly biomimicking GLP-1 because they're given at super physiologic doses, that's true. But GLP-1 is a hormone that is depleted in a lot of metabolic health conditions. So, insulin resistance related conditions, diabetes, obesity, PCOS, etc. There tends to be a GLP-1 deficiency. Has to do with inflammation in the gut, decreased GLP-1 production in the gut. So the hormones produced in the gut, it's called incretin hormone, and also just inflammation. Inflammatory cells in the gut have their own GLP-1 receptor, so they'll sop up the GLP-1 and make it more less bioavailable. So long story short, low GLP-1 levels are one of the markers for various metabolic diseases. Right now, we're treating a lot of people with GLP-1 receptor agonists, which are effective for weight loss. And I'm not against these drugs. Let's be clear, I'm not. However,
So Ozempic is a receptor agonist.
For GLP-1, yeah.
Okay.
I find it interesting that there are human data in a prominent journal showing that statins, a very common drug, deplete levels of GLP-1, which is a hormone and related to a blockbuster group of drugs. It cuts the levels in half. Steve, if you can bring up, it was like, it'll be say statin GLP-1 is the image or figure 1H. It's a blue line and a red line. Yeah, that one. So this was from a human trial, a 16-week human trial with, I think it was 20 mgs of atorvastatin versus control, if it's popping up. Those are the results.
Mm-hmm.
The red line's a statin. That's not subtle. It's not subtle at all. And so...
What is the blue line?
The blue line's the control group.
Okay, gotcha.
So it's a placebo-controlled trial. And basically it's showing, statins chop GLP-1 levels in half. And this was also associated with worse glycemic control, so an increase in average blood sugar, HbA1c, increase in insulin, and increase in insulin resistance, which are all kind of known effects.
Mm-hmm.
But what bothers me about this graph is not the effect. I'm not concluding from this, no, you can't take statins, or GLP-1s are, hack. I'm just perturbed that this comes out about a year and a half ago in a major journal.
Mm-hmm.
And there is not only no headlines featuring it, which, statins cut GLP-1 levels in human by half, should be a headline. I bet you if you replace the word statin with steak, that would have been a headline everywhere. Do you agree?
Or butter.
I think there's selective reporting. And then not only is it not presented in the media, but physicians don't talk about it. After I read this paper the same day, I polled 12 doctors in the area to ask them about this relationship. None of them knew about it. And this was in the Harvard area, presumably some pretty well-educated people who are like, why isn't this even in the realm of awareness? I don't think that physicians are hiding this information from people, but at the end of the day, if you're going to start a medication, you deserve to have some informed consent.
Right.
This is the kind of thing where it's like, I just think the patient should know in their decision-making process. It doesn't mean don't take either medication. Heck, if it works best for you, take both.
You should at least know what's going on.
This kind of information should be provided to patients, or at least be in the awareness of their physicians. Again, not saying anybody's sinister, but major paper, human trial, this is the result. Like, how is this not talked about? Oh, and I'll add, the mechanism they found out, which is quite interesting, is that the statin altered the gut microbiome and altered levels of a bacteria that generates what are called certain secondary bile acids. So primary bile acids can be metabolized by bacteria into secondary bile acids, and these have numerous effects throughout the body. So they get into circulation, they can impact the brain, muscles, fat, and one is called UDCA. And actually can be prescribed as a drug. And what they found in humans, again, is just giving back the UDCA basically reversed the effect.
Interesting.
So what I'm saying here is like, okay, there's a negative effect, and actually there's a solution that has been demonstrated in humans in a major journal. Mm-hmm. So you could use this in your patient population to improve care, maybe attenuate some of the negative effects of statins on GLP-1 and insulin resistance. But because we don't focus on metabolism and physiology, this gets entirely ignored. And that's just one small example about how I think dysfunctional norms and incentive structures lead to worse care. Again,
there's a broader context here that I think we should talk about. You mentioned this in the beginning with your Oreo experiment, but I'm not sure everyone knows the whole story. Your LDL went up quite high when you went keto. This is part of...
That happened to me too, yeah.
Right. This is part of common, not always, but commonly in human physiology. It happened to me a lot when I was strict carnivore.
Lean mass hyperresponders.
I just interrupt you for a sec. I was listening to your pod with Gary Brecka this morning, and you said your LDL was 125, right? And
now.
He's like, oh, that's high. And you're like, yeah, that's high. You know what mine is?
Mine's like 250.
Well, mine was as high as 500.
Whoa.
574.
Yeah. So
this is my last.
In the setting of...
I'm not, but to be clear, I'm not saying this is fine for all people.
I'm just measuring our LDL levels.
We can talk about it later. It's now open information.
Yeah.
Actually, it was Mark Hyman and Andrew Huberman was talking about my cholesterol and his pods. I'm like, all right, this is how you introduced me to the world.
Yeah.
But my cholesterol, we can talk about it. There's more nuance there. I'm not, well, let me stop interrupting you. We'll go back to it. Go ahead.
It's just interesting because in this context, and Nick has done a lot of research here, which is really interesting, and we should talk about it later in the podcast. Mm-hmm. I think we've all experienced this sort of lean mass hyperresponder phenotype, and basically the idea as I see it, and Nick can add context to this as he sees fit, is that in some individuals, particularly individuals who are lean and fit, when you move over to fat-based metabolism in a ketogenic type context, there are more energy moving molecules in the blood, and that LDL actually moves triglycerides and cholesterol. And so it's not uncommon in human physiology to see LDL go up as a physiologic, perhaps not pathologic response in a ketogenic diet. Whether or not this represents an increase in cardiovascular disease risk is the main question.
Right.
And the central question here, which is something that I'm thinking of as you're describing this paper and the response to it, or lack of response to it in the general sort of media space, is that ApoB and LDL, ApoB containing lipoproteins are, that's a broader term for LDL and other lipoproteins, which are broadly felt to be atherogenic. These are sacrosanct in Western medicine, and anything that challenges that hypothesis, this lipid hypothesis, is just disregarded or is not felt to be valid and is kind of cast out to the side. So it's quite interesting because that's a very central theme. If we'll talk about seed oils in this podcast, and it comes back to that same idea in many ways. ApoB I see as like a linchpin in Western medicine, and having my LDL go up super high, and then having it, I had a similar response to Nick's. I mean, I eat carbohydrates now. I don't eat carbs. When you mentioned that you
like fruit,
I eat fruit and honey,
right,
and milk. So milk has lactose, but
you're not eating bowls of cereal.
I don't eat bowls of cereal or rice or oats or pasta. And there's different responses to different grains, perhaps based on their processing. So, and processed carbohydrates, processed sugars probably react differently in the human gut than fruits and fruit juice. But so I include carbohydrates in my diet now. I found for myself, after a year and a half of long-term strict carnivore, so meat and organs and fat, that my eczema got better, but my electrolytes did not stay within normal limits.
Right.
It turns out that there is a need for insulin signaling at the level of the kidney to resorb certain electrolyte molecules.
Yes.
And that a lot of people, not everyone, some people probably do better with long-term strict keto than others. I had massive electrolyte imbalances that were resolved when I added carbohydrates back. My immune conditions did not come back with the addition of fruit and squash and honey, but I know that for me, if I include things like tomato, for instance, which is technically a fruit, but within this nightshade family, that I will get a recurrence of eczema. So some things...
Interesting.
This is what's interesting, and what I've kind of seen over the years is that for people who have autoimmune conditions, inflammatory bowel diseases, eczema, skin conditions, psoriasis, there are some foods that are widely considered to be healthy that can be triggers for some people. And that's that's something that I was never taught in medical school. And it's probably not something that everyone needs to worry about, but if people have unresolved autoimmune conditions, it's something to be aware of. More broadly, I think the LDL conversation is that in Nick's case, and again, I'll let him add context here if I'm leaving anything out. And in my case also, strict keto leads to a lean mass hyperresponder, quote, rise in LDL. We can talk about cardiovascular implications for that later in the podcast, but the addition of carbohydrates, whether it's fruit and honey and squash or Oreos, then changes your physiology. You're no longer in ketosis, and the LDL can come down. So that just so people understand that's probably what happened to Nick with his Oreos in the beginning, which is this really sort of viral illustration of the fact that you can lower LDL just by changing your macronutrient ratios.
Is LDL bad? If you have high LDL, is that bad?
See, Nick sort of foreshadowed this. My perspective, Nick can add if he feels differently, is that it's contextual, right? And this is a really, really important question. It's a really important question. As Nick has suggested, the statin industry is potentially $1 trillion industry. There are a lot of financial zeros on the line here if LDL is not all it seems. The mainstream medical perspective is that LDL and ApoB containing lipoproteins are atherogenic. They are bad. They directly cause atherosclerosis.
Yes.
I don't agree with that based on what I've seen. I think it's much more nuanced and contextual. Broadly, when I look at the evidence with ApoB and LDL, we can just use one of those terms moving forward. In humans who demonstrate markers suggestive of insulin sensitivity, metabolic health, there is a different effect, cardiovascular sort of correlate for LDL levels than there is in people who are metabolically unwell. If you are a diabetic and you have a high LDL, that does seem to consistently represent a significantly increased risk of cardiovascular disease. In some cases, 4 to 6x, right?
Wow.
A low LDL. If you are metabolically healthy, which is something that we can really only achieve proxies for, whether it's an HDL
Right.
or, unfortunately, very few studies are done with fasting insulin. I think if studies were done with fasting insulin, that's probably the best marker.
Fasting insulin.
That's an easily obtainable blood marker. I'm actually not familiar with a single study that's done with fasting insulin, but if you look at things that approximate insulin, or you use that as sort of a third variable, anything that approximates insulin sensitivity, you see a markedly attenuated relationship between LDL levels and increased cardiovascular risk. And so I think that there's a question, to me, if something is causal, you get into this sort of semantics of what is causality, right? Is something consistently associated with a process enough to claim causality? I have my brain is simple in this respect. I think if something causes it, then LDL must be enough to initiate atherosclerosis on its own. And if you're saying LDL causes atherosclerosis, the associated inference is that more LDL is always bad. And
Yes.
that's really the relevant clinical question is, if you, Danny, go and eat a ketogenic diet and your LDL goes up, does that represent an increased risk of cardiovascular disease for you? Is that something we need to be aware of? Or if you become more metabolically healthy because you're getting rid of garbage foods, if you're getting rid of, quote, carbs, right?
Yeah.
And you become more metabolically healthy with a higher LDL,
Right.
is it possible that your cardiovascular risk is the same or lower? Now, so this is where the nuance comes in. I think it's very contextual. And like I said, if you stratify the relationship between LDL and cardiovascular disease, there's a marked attenuation when people are insulin sensitive
Interesting.
versus insulin resistant. So
And the best way to determine whether or not you're getting the LDL is really affecting you is to get the CT angiograms, where they basically put you inside of a CT scan with dye in your arteries and see how much plaque you have.
probably the best imaging, that
Yeah.
you could do is a CT angio. I mean, there's something called a CAC, but it's not
Right.
not the same
The only
test.
problem with CT angio is you got to go in that freaking cancer machine. They radiate.
It's a lot of radiation.
Right.
Yeah. You don't want to do it.
Above age
Every
40, a CAC is pretty good in terms of, let's say, a warranty on your heart.
I got a CAC and it said it was 0.
Yeah.
But I also, I think it might have been Dom who told me this, that his parents got a CAC and it was 0. And then they also went and got a CT angio right after. And it said they had I don't know if it might have been somebody else. And they said that the CT angio, they had a high amount of plaque, but their CAC score was still 0.
Yeah.
Depends what algorithm they use to interpret the
Right.
CT
Right.
angio.
You're getting dangerously close to things that I'm not supposed to talk about yet.
I can
until
talk ab-
Friday.
I
but
can talk about
we
it.
can talk about what you know. A couple things I want to poke at. We can come back to the CAT thing later. I actually want to put on my Jade Tower academic prude hat for a minute for a purpose.
Ivory Tower.
Ivory Tower Harvard prude hat. So, Paul, you effectively said ApoB is not causal. And you've said that, right?
I don't believe ApoB is cause. I don't believe there's enough evidence to suggest that ApoB is causal.
Okay.
Which means what again?
So
Necessary but not sufficient.
It's okay.
But the way you described it seemed like you were talking about. So let me unpack these terms. Causal definitionally, and this is important. Definitionally means it is necessary and part of the causal cascade. Effectively.
And you're when you say ApoB, you mean LDL.
So we should probably define these.
Yes.
ApoB is stands for apolipoprotein B.
Yes.
It is an apolipoprotein on LDL particles. So there are more particles than just LDL.
It's a proxy of LDL.
It's a proxy of an LDL particle count. So it's a better marker for LDL, whereas your standard LDL cholesterol is the cholesterol fraction generally calculated in all the LDL specific type ApoB containing lipoproteins. If that doesn't make sense, they're proxies for one another as far as we're concerned. If there's a divergence, we will highlight it.
Okay, and Paul is saying that it's not causal.
Right. And then he's trying to redefine what you mean by causal. And the reason I bring this up is because in these discussions, that little chink in the armor is all you need, and you know this, for conventional academics to write you off and leverage that within academia to say, this person doesn't know what he's talking about. Let's go through the evidence proving LDL is causal or ApoB is causal. So again, it's interesting social dynamics. My position on ApoB is it's causal insofar as it's necessary, but I agree with Paul, context. So to think about this graphically, if you imagine like, a simple like XY axis, and on the Y axis is the amount of plaque you're accumulating in your heart. The X axis is your exposure to ApoB. And let's say that there is a positive relationship. Is it a really steep line? Or is it super, super shallow?
Mm-hmm.
And if it's super, super shallow, because say you have a positive hormonal and metabolic milieu, then that needs to be weighted when making decisions about what intervention you start or don't, or stay on or don't. So, if your absolute risk increase from having high ApoB is actually quite low on an individual basis, and there's ways we can figure this out, that's different than I have already had a heart attack and I have metabolic syndrome and I had a standard American diet and my ApoB and LDL are through the roof. Those are two very different things.
Yes.
And the failure to wrap context around this individual marker, that's the issue. The issue is not that the marker doesn't have any value in and of itself. That's more or less my position. And it's also why I'm very comfortable giving, recommendations, advice on like ways to lower your ApoB if that's desired, while myself living with crazy high LDL. Mm-hmm. A pattern that arises in my social media that I think confuses people is I'll often talk about things in a positive light that I don't adopt myself. So for example, particular fibers I think can be very beneficial. I eat basically a zero fiber diet because of my context, because of my history of IBD, how it affects me personally. And what works for me shouldn't generalize to another person.
Do you eat any fruit at all, like Paul does, or any carbs at all?
No. But I will add, were I not to need a ketogenic diet therapeutically for my IBD, I would happily eat a sweet potato or some fruit. I by no means think those are bad things. And guess what? It would lower my LDL and ApoB substantially, which isolated probably would, all things being equal, be more likely to lower my risk specifically for CVD than other things.
So you eat zero carbs?
Basically. I'm always in ketosis.
Carbohydrates.
Carbohydrates.
Because that word carbs is kind of like a colloquialism, right? People hear carbs, they think like pasta, bread. Yeah. So carbohydrates, I don't think you eat any carbohydrates because you definitely don't eat any carbs.
Yeah. Right. I'll have a little bit, but nothing that will kick me out of ketosis for a prolonged period of time.
What do you typically eat throughout the day?
Now, probably, so I eat 2 meals a day, probably in like in a 6 to 7 hour window. So
breakfast and dinner?
Yeah, breakfast and dinner, like 11 a.m., noon, I'll have a meal. Probably eggs, cheese, salmon, olive oil, maybe some macadamia nuts, and then dinner can be fish, chicken, steak. I'm pretty simple.
No sides, just the meat.
Pretty much.
Wow.
Pretty much. And the thing is, I like these foods. Like, if I could, without GI upset or any consequences, have like a big dish of like Brussels sprouts with like dried cranberries and walnuts. That sounds delicious. And I think for a lot of people it could be healthy. But no, it's not worth it for me. It makes me feel unwell.
I understand,
And there's a lot of individual context. And so seed oils is another good example. Well, actually...
And why do you, so there's like a lot of people don't like to eat breakfast. I think breakfast is bad.
I mean, breakfast is fine.
You skip lunch.
Well, when I say breakfast, I mean when I break my fast. So 11, 12, sometimes 1.
Okay, I gotcha.
So yeah, lunch, dinner, if you want to say it.
I heard that the metabolism is working way harder in the morning. So it's better to eat in the morning and it slows down at high noon.
I think that's kind of a fairy tale. What do you think?
I don't know if there's any evidence for that.
I do not think fruit is bad. I do think fructose as a biomolecule can be uniquely harmful when it's in the wrong place. So like, at the liver, there's a lot of things, and we can get into the biochemistry if we want, that it can do, but that's not the point. The point is rather that, I don't love this phrase, but the body is smart. So if you have like glucose, you can consume glucose, it'll go get absorbed, go through the portal vein, hit the liver. The same thing won't happen with fructose. Fructose actually, it gets biotransformed by the small intestine into glucose and other organic acids. So when you say have like a handful of blueberries, the amount of fructose in those blueberries, negligible amount actually gets to the liver. It's biotransformed into other sugars and organic acids beforehand. Right. So in this case, it's one of those things where like, when we're talking about exogenous intake, the dose makes the poison. I think that kind of thing often gets overlooked, and it can also reconcile why like potentially fructose from, saying, having a bowl of cereal with a glass of orange juice, which will saturate this mechanism. It'll overflow, and then you will get more of a fructose assault on your liver, is different, and not just like linearly associated with, saying, having some blueberries. And it's the same thing with, like, I was asking somebody the other day, do they think fructose is uniquely harmful? Someone with good physiology background, they said yes. And then I asked them, like, do you think blueberries are harmful? Like, well, no. There's a lot that is in a blueberry that's not just fructose. And what I find interesting is the double standard. Because when we talk about saturated fat, a lot of people say, well, saturated fat is bad. And then extend that logic to dairy is bad, butter is bad, steak is bad. And I just want to show that those leaps of logic are actually very similar. So, like, from the whole human perspective, generally there's more to the whole food in terms of how it impacts your body than focusing on, like, one component that it might be rich in. Anyway, Paul, what were you going to say about the...
No, that's a great segue to that point. So if you look at the research on fructose, I think fructose is a molecule we've been sort of told to fear incorrectly. If you look at the research in fructose, either in animal models or in humans, it's almost always given in isolation. Glucose has two transporters in the gut. There's SGLT1 and there's GLUT2. Fructose is GLUT5. But when glucose and fructose are administered together, fructose can use GLUT2 with glucose. So what you get when you administer fructose by itself is you get fructose malabsorption. And fructose malabsorption leads to overgrowth of dysbiotic bacteria in the gut. But that doesn't happen with human food. There's no food that humans consume in a whole food form that has isolated fructose.
Right.
But if you look at the literature with animals or humans, a lot of times people will be given IV fructose, right? Or they'll given pure fructose. These don't, it goes back to kind of what we were saying, the difference between an isolated component of a food and the whole food. So if you look at the studies on fruit, they're invariably healthy for humans. I mean, you look at even
there's
fruit,
fiber, there's all kinds of
well,
things.
even without fiber, even looking at fruit juices, so orange juice, pomegranate juice, cherry juice, grape juice, watermelon juice, the list goes on and on. These all improve outcomes, whether it's DNA damage, whether it's oxidative stress, whether it's LDL oxidation, endothelial function. You can give someone watermelon juice with a glucose tolerance test, and it improves insulin sensitivity during the glucose tolerance test. So a glucose tolerance test, you give someone isolated processed sugar. It's called a glucola. It's basically like a sugar drink. And you look to see how well the body disposes of that with insulin handling and sugar handling, glucose handling in the body. And when you give extra, quote, sugar with watermelon juice, it actually improves the handling of that glucola. So you can improve by giving extra sugar in a whole food form. Cherry juice.
Acutely.
Yeah, cherry juice, blueberries, all these things, they have great effects in the short term when you're using them. So the fruit, I'm not familiar, maybe Nick knows one. I haven't seen a single study with whole fruit that suggests there's a harm to humans. Or even a fruit juice that's not like a super, like Sunny D, like a fake fruit juice. So I think that a lot of it is conflating studies that are misrepresenting fructose by itself as opposed to glucose and fructose co-administration. And so I don't see fructose as a harmful molecule when we're eating it in that package. And then this is an interesting kind of perspective gaze to the difference between fruit and processed sugar. Because if you look at the data, at least observationally and in terms of populations, processed sugar, which is just, technically speaking, it's a disaccharide of glucose and fructose, that looks harmful for humans. But when you give a glucose and fructose together in a fruit or a honey, these have different effects on humans. They just don't look to be harmful. I mean, honey has many, many trials showing improvements in metabolic health with honey, right? Something people think of as pure sugar.
Right.
And they forget that honey has probably 300 to 350 bioactive components along with the sugar. So I think what's going on here is at the level of the gut flora, that when you give isolated fructose, you get fructose malabsorption, you get dysbiosis. If you give isolated sucrose, which is this disaccharide of glucose and fructose, you also cause dysbiosis. You cause overgrowth of the wrong type of bacteria in the gut. And that can lead to increased levels of a molecule in the human body called LPS, lipopolysaccharide. And you see this, it's also known as endotoxin. You can give humans sugar and see endotoxin levels rise. Now, endotoxin is another really negative signaling molecule in the human body. It actually tells the mitochondria, like, hey, you're broken. It's a component of the gram-negative cell wall, gram-negative bacteria. So you don't want acute endotoxemia when you are eating a processed sugar. And what's interesting is when you give honey or when you give fruit, which contains sugar, you don't get that effect. You don't get LPS rising.
Interesting.
You don't get endotoxemia because these compounds in the fruit probably prevent the overgrowth of the bacteria.
Right.
A lot of the bioactives or these compounds in the whole foods actually affect the gut bacteria by preventing overgrowth. It's incredibly complex, right? That the food we eat affects this delicate balance, this symphony of gut microbial populations in our intestines, and that has effects on the human body. So people will say the same thing to me, and I see this from a lot of the keto influencers, not Nick. Nick doesn't say this, but
You're like a little not Nick, but he's thumb pointing.
not this guy. No, but like other keto influencers will say, honey is the same as Coca-Cola, or orange juice is the same as Coca-Cola. I mean, there was a popular influencer saying that recently. Glucose Goddess was saying that, this French biochemist.
Glucose Goddess.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
She was saying this, and you think like, well, that's not true. Like you look at the actual effects on human physiology at multiple levels, you get completely different effects. I mean, orange juice improves endothelial function. Sugar worsens endothelial function, which is sort of the reactivity. Yeah. And I think that one of the main parts of the mechanism here has to do with the overgrowth of bacteria in the gut, and then this attendant increase in these molecules in the human body, LPS, also known as endotoxin, and the negative effects those have. So the idea here is just like, and Nick mentioned this, in this sort of population study, when sugar rations changed, you saw an increase in sugar potentially affect the epigenome, right? The way that humans are programmed. And I think that like an increase in fruit rations probably wouldn't have the same effect. So when we're talking about carbohydrates and humans, the quality of the carbohydrate, like we've talked about throughout this podcast, matters massively. I don't think humans need to fear fruit. There's probably some inter-individual variation, but these foods look to be delicate in the way that they affect the human body and the microbiome and the way it all connects. It's really interesting stuff.
I agree with Paul mostly. The thing I really agree with is like the package matters. We're talking about compounds in blueberries, honey, or like we were talking about walnuts earlier, like the effect of like elagitannins on is it urolithin A or hippuric acid? I think it's urolithin A is the downstream product. But basically like your microbiome will interact with components that are in your food and generate compounds that can have more powerful metabolic effects than the macronutrients or subgroups therein, like fructose, than we give it credit for. And other factors, actually, just quick tangent. You're talking about like the basically leaky gut and toxemia. There's also new data showing that you can manipulate your mucin lining and change the gut flora with stress. So stress it changes signaling in a region called the amygdala, and there's a signal to glands in the gut called Brunner's glands that change mucin production. So like another way where like all of these things converge. We're talking about like psychosocial things. They're not isolated. They converge on these metabolic pathways. But getting back to my point on fruit, I totally agree. Like a soda and like a honeycomb are two entirely different things. Fruit is not bad. Fruit requires context. But to that end, one of the things I really hate, and I think you probably feel the same way, is platitudes. So I hate the things of like, get your 5 a day, eat the rainbow, fruit is always good. Because it's like, oh, hell, I'm not going to say a mango is bad per se, but if you have metabolic syndrome and your choice is a mango, blueberries, or hard-boiled eggs for breakfast, like I'm going to go with first the hard-boiled eggs, then the blueberry, and I don't know. I'm iffy on the mango.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Can I add some context there?
Yeah.
So I think that in the setting of metabolic syndrome, my perspective is that you have essentially broken mitochondria, right? You have broken energy partitioning. You have broken signaling in the cell that's creating this insulin-resistant signal. And so in the setting of metabolic dysfunction, you don't process carbohydrates well, but the carbohydrates didn't cause the problem per se. So I don't think a mango, if you have metabolic syndrome, you're not going to handle the mango well, but the mango didn't get you there. I don't think you became metabolically unwell or insulin resistant eating mangoes. I think you became metabolically unwell. This is my hypothesis. Eating processed sugar, affecting your gut flora negatively, and potentially packing the membranes of your cells and mitochondria with too many seed oils and the derivatives. So
well, I mean,
these are the two greatest movers that I see.
In terms of the actual metabolism, I mean, like fructose does have unique metabolism. So like in the early stages of glycolysis, that is a unique enzyme from glucose. And this enzyme actually doesn't have a positive feedback loop. Sorry, a negative feedback loop. So it can go kind of unchecked, deplete intercellular ATP. This has been shown, lead to activation of, I think it's NAPD NADPH oxidase 4 and cause mitochondrial dysfunction.
But
So we
it's
talk about
so small. You talked about this earlier. The amount of fructose that you absorb, it's so small.
well,
Like, because
depending
it's
on
so
what
much-
you're eating.
it's all just converted to different things. You know, like I
So-
don't think all that mitochondrial.
So a couple blueberries couldn't do that.
No.
But could the fructose from and this is the difficult hypothetical, because I said like the bowl of Rice Krispie, cereal and orange juice, there's gonna be too much fructose in that for the pathway's gonna be saturated. So I'm saying,
Yeah, I don't
could
know
a
about that.
component
Because if you look at it, I mean, in diabetics, there was a study where they had increasing amounts of honey, and they went up to 125 grams a day. 125 grams a day of honey in a diabetic.
I think
It's about 50% fructose. And granted, maybe it's not enough in one single bolus, but that actually improved glucose handling.
acutely.
Yeah.
Well, but I mean, like I can eat Oreo cookies acutely and drop in my LDL. Does that mean Oreo cookies are good for long-term
Well, I
outcome?
mean,
Or like,
it's just speculative, you know?
I think a lot of this is speculative. I think
I think it was an 8-week study.
I think
you
the
know?
human study, the saturation started to kick in around like 0.5 gram per kilogram or something,
Yeah.
which you can saturate in a meal. I'm not being definitive on this. I just don't like the idea. How's another way to put this? People say like empty calories. This is something that we can probably agree on. Is I think the term empty calories is stupid because it suggests that like the macronutrient cargo, like the carrier, is itself inert and just energy. But the macronutrients, the things that give you energy, the stearic acid, the palmitic acid, the myristic acid, short chain fatty acids, fructose, sucrose, whatever. They're each unique biomolecules with unique effects.
Of course.
So stearic acid, probably can improve mitochondrial function.
We know it does.
Yeah. So that's the broader concept I'm getting to. I guess coming back and probably bringing it to the end because I'm going to not miss my plane.
Yeah, you got to leave soon.
Is that context matters, and what I mean by that is this is difficult to explain without just coming off as this is so hand wavy to be useless, but I think it's useful, and I'll try to explain why. When we're talking about, like, say, macronutrient groups, this is a very diverse set of molecules that is then packaged in foods that have been processed differently and have different bioactive effects that go into a system that processes it in many different ways. As it gets bioconverted in the small intestines, is the linoleic acid oxidized by myeloperoxidase because you have excess fat tissue, or is it converted to 4-HNE or 12-13-dihomine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It gets so complicated that when you look at the platitudes that we hear bandied about, get your LDL down, eat less saturated fat, butter bad. It's comical.
Yeah,
It's
I agree.
it's comical, it's
Totally.
useless, and it is the basis for why nutrition is so frustrating and confusing for people.